How much is my case worth? That is a question that we get from basically every single client that comes through our doors. And it is a valid question, and it is one that deserves a real answer. If you have looked at all online or you have seen commercials related to asbestos cases, you have probably heard a lot of very large numbers thrown out for what a case might be worth, or how much money is available for people to get compensated from. So on today's episode, we are going to be addressing that question head on. What could your case potentially be worth? Welcome to the Asbestos Files, where we expose corporate greed, cut through the confusion, and fight for people who deserve answers. My name is Sophie Zavalia, and I'm a trial attorney at SWMW Law, where we believe that when corporations put profits over safety, that people deserve an advocate in their corner who is willing to fight for them. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about case worth and addressing this very valid question of, hey, look, if I call an attorney, what could I potentially be looking at in the way of compensation? How much is my case worth? Well, the reality is that there is no single answer to that question. There are gonna certainly be a lot of people who can make promises that frankly they may not be able to keep without even looking at a case and say, oh, that's $1 million case, that's a multi-million-dollar case, that's a $50,000 case. The reality is that every single case is different. And one of the things that I have told clients in the past as a way to explain this is that we start from zero. Anytime a case comes into our office, the case on its own is not worth anything, right? The way that a case has value is the information that we are able to get to add value to that claim. And so another way of putting it is that if a person has an asbestos-related disease, if they have a diagnosis and they seek an attorney and ask that question of how much is my case worth, we have to look at several factors. One of those is the disease itself. So mesothelioma, as we have talked about in other episodes, and maybe you have heard this online, mesothelioma is a very rare form of cancer that has one recognized cause in the United States, and that is exposure to asbestos. So another way of putting this is that mesothelioma is known as a signature disease for exposure to asbestos. The two are basically synonymous. If you have one, if you have mesothelioma, the likelihood is almost certain that you have been exposed to asbestos at some point over the course of your life. You may not know where and you may not know when, but those two go hand in hand. So when we have a case that involves mesothelioma, right off the bat, that increases the value of a case, of the theoretical value of a case, because there's going to be very little that a defendant or that a company that made asbestos-containing products can say that is going to throw that diagnosis into doubt. And so there's, that doesn't stop them from trying, right? Lots of companies will deny that mesothelioma and asbestos are synonymous with one another. But the reality is that every single health organization across the globe agrees that if you have meso, that is a signature disease for exposure to asbestos. And so there's less to call into question in a case like that. Now, when we deal with other types of diseases, for example, lung cancer can be caused by all range of different types of exposures. Smoking, for example, smoking cigarettes can cause lung cancer, and a lot of our clients are exposed to asbestos and also smoke cigarettes. But that is another cause of that type of disease. If you have something like asbestosis, really all that is just scarring of the lungs. Lots of different products, lots of different substances can cause scarring to the lungs. And so there's more that a company can call into doubt about your diagnosis if you have something like a lung cancer or an asbestosis or sort of pulmonary fibrosis, where a company can come in and say, hey, look, there are all these other things that could have caused this, not necessarily asbestos. The reason that matters for case worth is that affects the value of the case. And so that is one thing that we look at, is how strong of a diagnosis do we have? Do we have evidence? And there are objective factors that point to someone being exposed to asbestos. Is that present in the medical records? Those are things that we look at. We also look at things like, how old a person is when they're diagnosed. So, for example, even though it may make the case a lot more difficult to prove up, if a person is young when they get diagnosed with mesothelioma, that potentially increases the value of the case, because we are dealing with somebody who is not at the end of their life. They have, if they're in their 30s or their 40s, they, conceivably would have had another 30 to 40 years at least to live. And so that increases the value of the case because it makes it more of, more in the way of damages, for lack of a better phrase. Anything that kind of builds the heartbreak of the case, quite frankly, increases its value and is something that we look at when we look at, evaluating what type of case we have. Now, that's not to say that if you are in your 60s or 70s or even your 80s, that your case is not worth anything. Frankly, all human life is sacred. So, it's not to say that if you're older, your case isn't worth anything. It's just one of many, many factors that not only we look at when we evaluate a case, but that the defendants are going to look at when they are deciding whether or not they want to pay on a particular claim. Another factor that we look at when a case comes in is not just the diagnosis, but also whether or not we can prove how that individual was exposed to asbestos. And so, there are a lot of voices in the American consciousness right now that say, basically, the tort reform activists that want you to believe that, well, all you have to do to make $1 million in a civil court is all you got to do is just file a lawsuit, and then you just get handed a check for $1 million because it's all a scam, right? That is just could not be further from how things actually operate in a civil justice system. So when we file a lawsuit, we have the burden of proof. What does that mean? It means that we have to prove through evidence, whether it's testimony, whether it's through records, whether it is through corporate documents, whether it is through military documents, all range of evidence. We have to provide that evidence to show that Joe Smith, who has mesothelioma, or Mr. Jones, who has lung cancer, that through their work or through their home life, that they were exposed to specific companies that created asbestos-containing products. And so the reason I bring this up is because this happens a lot of times when people come through our doors. They tell us they've been exposed to asbestos, but they may not know how. And they may not remember the products they work with, and they may not remember, where they worked over the course of their life. They may not remember different coworker names. Sometimes we even get people who are coming in and they die very shortly after they've hired us as their attorney. That happens, unfortunately, more often than I would like to admit, that because we are serving clients who are very sick most of the times, they may pass away before we can get a full picture of how they were exposed. The reason that matters for what a case is worth is that if we have someone, let's say, who comes into our office, has just been diagnosed with mesothelioma, we meet with them a couple times and they're simply just too sick to tell us where they worked over time or what specific products they would have worked with or what their job responsibilities were, and then they pass away, the path to proving up how specifically that person was exposed to specific companies' products gets a lot harder and affects how much we're able to do in the way of adding value to that case. The flip side of that is if we have someone who comes in who we know has an asbestos-related disease, and either they have their own records or they have a very good memory about, look, I worked at this factory from 1965 to 1970. Here are a list of coworkers, and then we're able to use that information to do our own research and to get records from those places and figure out what companies were there, compare it with other clients that we've had who've worked at those same facilities. All of those things allow us to get a clearer picture of the specifics of that person's exposure to asbestos. And in turn, what that does is it increases the value of the case. And so if we are able to go after more companies, for example, if we know the specifics about the specific products that were at a factory, or different brakes that a mechanic worked with, or different types of cars that mechanic worked with, or whether we have, knowledge about if someone served in the military and they served aboard a particular naval ship, we're able to go after those records and find out, who made the boiler, who made the pump, who made the valves that were aboard that ship. All of those things increase the value of a case, because the more evidence we have about how people were exposed to asbestos, the more the case is worth, because it's a stronger case and it's a more convincing case. Another factor that we look at that relates to kind of this exposure history, that's another way of referring to what I was just talking about. But another thing that we look at is how long a person was exposed to asbestos. And so we have seen an entire range of exposure histories. Some people on the lower end may have only been exposed to asbestos for a couple weeks, maybe a month tops. That's going to be lower on the scale of kind of what that person's case may be worth, because it's a smaller exposure. And so it may be harder to tie that person's disease to that limited exposure point. It doesn't mean that if someone's only exposed to asbestos for a week or a month, that their case is worthless. It just affects the total value of the case. On the other end of the spectrum, we have people who worked in asbestos-containing industries their entire careers. And so we're talking about anywhere from 20 to 40, sometimes up to 50 years of exposure to a whole range of different companies' products that we know to have contained asbestos. And so when we're dealing sort of on that side of the scale of exposure history, a case like that, if we can line up the specific companies that the person worked with or their products that were around, that is going to greatly increase the value of a case, rather than somebody who may have only been exposed for a couple of days or a week or a month. Another factor that we look at is the viability of the companies that are at issue. And so what I mean by that, that's just another way of saying that over the course of time, there are companies that have admitted that they made asbestos-containing products. They sold those products. They put them into, the stream of commerce, and people used their products. They don't deny it. But over time, through companies like that getting sued over and over for the toxins they put into the economy, basically, a lot of companies have gone bankrupt over time. And so that affects the value of a case. So if a person comes in and they spent their entire career at a company that now has gone out of business entirely, there may not be compensation to be received. If the person has worked with the products of a company that has set up a bankruptcy trust, there is probably going to be a way to get compensation for that person, but it may not be as much as if the company was still in business and still making money today. And so that's one factor that we look at. And again, this is a very brief overview. These are things that if you find an attorney, if you need an attorney and you hire one for an asbestos-related case, they'll be able to go over the specifics with you. But this is just very in broad strokes, kind of what generally we look at. And again, if the company's out of business and there's no insurance to get and there's no money to be found, there's not a whole lot that we can do as a law firm. And that's the unfortunate reality of the latency period of asbestos-related diseases, which is, a subject for another podcast. But, people usually don't get sick until 20 or 30 years down the road. And so when we have these cases come in, we're having to look in the past, and the unfortunate reality is that some of those companies have gone out of business over time. Another factor that we look at is what legally is called jurisdiction and venue. And so all that to say that we do our best at my law firm, and I think, all asbestos law firms do this same analysis of trying to figure out the best place to file a lawsuit based on where the person is from, the person who's gotten sick, where they lived, where they were exposed, and how we may best get compensation for them if we file a lawsuit. And so there's a lot to that question. Again, a lot that and if you hire an attorney that they can explain to you. But suffice to say is that there are absolutely some jurisdictions, and that just means there are some courts that are much friendlier to companies versus some jurisdictions, some venues, some courts are much more favorable to plaintiffs and people who have gotten sick. And there are some that are right down the middle that just kind of, no side gets a particular advantage. And so we consider all of those things before we file a lawsuit because it affects how much money we're able to recover on behalf of that person who is sick. Then there's also the many different circumstances that are individual to a particular client. And so that affects the value of a case as well. So we've already talked about the length of exposure. That's something that is individual to every single client, how long they were exposed. We've talked about the age at which the person was when they got diagnosed with that illness. We look at things like what their occupations were. Does it make sense that if they were a mechanic, that they were working with brake materials or clutches? Well, of course that makes sense. Some people come in and they have occupations that may initially not be very clear for how they were exposed. So for example, we've represented architects who at first blush, it's difficult to kind of line up how they may have been exposed. And through doing our investigation and doing what we do at our firm, we were, able to track down certain types of exposures that maybe they didn't even remember when they first came into our office. And that's part of, our job is to really leave no stone unturned, in other words, as to linking up how a person may have gotten exposed to asbestos. And then other individual factors are things like, is the person still alive? Or have they passed away? And both of those statuses, both of whether the person's alive or whether they're deceased, can have an effect on how much a case is worth. We look at how much money they may have lost. So for example, again, if we're talking about somebody who got sick at a very young age, we're talking about a lot of lost wages if we are assuming that they've gotten so sick that either they have to completely stop working or if they pass away. Sometimes we've had clients who have lost out on decades of income. That increases the value of a case when we go against these companies because we fight for people and say that it's not fair. It's not fair that these people lost out on this income because they got sick from a totally preventable disease that was caused by exposure to something that companies knew to cause cancer. And that sort of unfairness, that feeling of like, this just is not fair. A lot of times that is what increases the value of a case for companies because they know that if a case gets brought before a jury, and if there are really egregious circumstances, which most of the time there are in these type of cases, most of the time there are those smoking gun documents that show that a company knew what they were doing was wrong. And they don't want to run the risk of getting, these huge verdicts that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about in the news, $10, $20 million. So when they look at the value of a case, that's one of the things defendants look at, and that's one of the things that we as a result look at as well when we're choosing whether or not to take a case. Finally, another thing that we look at in terms of whether a case has, more or less value is we look for, again, the human factors that go behind the case. Do we have a family that's willing to stand by that person who is ill? Do we have a tight-knit group of a spouse or children or grandchildren that make it extra bad, for lack of a better phrase, that this person has gotten sick? That's not to say that if you don't have a huge family, your case isn't worth anything, certainly. But again, when we are looking at what sort of value these cases have. Obviously, the more sympathetic of a circumstance that people have, and most of the time the people we work with have that kind of circumstance, we're talking about, just to give you an example, the vast majority of the people I work with did one thing, and that is work their entire lives so that they could support their family. And that type of a story, that type of a reality, can increase the value of a case because, again, it is something that scares the defendants in this litigation. They don't want a sympathetic plaintiff going before a jury and saying, look, I worked hard my whole life to, all I ever wanted, it wasn't to get rich. The point of me working was because it was honest work so that I could support my family and hopefully retire and be able to enjoy, my children or grandchildren in the last years of my life. And that when, the people that come into our office who I talk to, that has been robbed of them. They don't have that opportunity anymore because, not through any fault of their own, but because companies made decisions decades ago to put a cancer-causing substance into their products. And, the vast majority of the time, the people I represent don't even know that that's what they were working with. They just knew they were there to do their job. And now they've gotten, a cancer or some sort of disease as a result. And I cannot stress enough how these stories they will break your heart. And companies do not want that to go before a jury because they know what happens when that type of a case goes before a jury. And so if we have that in our cases, that usually increases the value of the case. There's also, and we've mentioned this in an earlier episode, value is also driven by whether there is a viable company. We talked about that already in this episode, but also how many different kind of companies we can kind of point to as being the exposure points. There are also, and we've mentioned it today and also in previous episodes, there's a whole system of bankruptcy trusts that are set up that provide value to people who have gotten sick from asbestos-related diseases. And there's a lot of kind of complicated procedures to all of that, but the point being that that it affects the value of a case. If you're going after a lot of bankruptcy trusts versus solvent companies who are still in business, it's just a matter of kind of piecing through the different types of exposures that you can kind of point to these companies on, and it will affect the value of the case. So the bottom line being, if you are curious about not only whether you have a case, but whether or not it is worth your time, whether it is worth your energy, and whether you'll even see any money at the end of doing all of that work, the point is you need to be talking to a lawyer who not only does this litigation, but can ask you the right questions and kind of make a better determination based on your individual factors and your individual circumstances as to how much a case is worth. And I will just tell you that if you have anybody who, without hearing your case, without hearing your specifics, promises you a big old bucket of money, they probably don't know what they're talking about, and you need to seek out somebody who actually knows what they're doing and can give you an honest assessment of, what your case may be worth. For our next segment, we're going to be talking about myth versus fact, and I've got a couple of myths that I want to talk to you about today and give you the reality behind what's going on with those myths. So the first myth I want to talk about today is that there is a standard payout in cases. Every single mesothelioma gets X number of dollars. This could not be further from the truth. And again, if someone is telling you without knowing anything about you, without knowing anything about your case, if they're saying, hey, if you have mesothelioma, you're guaranteed to get $1 million or $5 million or $100,000, you need to just completely disregard that person entirely because they don't know what they're talking about. The reality is that no two cases are the same. Whether you have mesothelioma, whether you have lung cancer, or any other type of asbestos-related disease, every single case is different, and every single case is going to have a different range of values depending on a whole range of factors, including age at the time of diagnosis, what type of occupation that person had, the length of exposure that they had to asbestos, whether the companies that they worked with are still in business, whether there are a lot of different exposure points instead of just one exposure point. All of these things affect the value of the case, and that's why nobody should be guaranteeing you how much your case is worth, because if they're doing that, they frankly don't know what they're doing. every case is different, and that's why you need to seek out a professional who knows kind of how this litigation works and has been doing it long enough to know the values of these types of cases before you get that sort of range of value. The next myth is trust fund claims are chump change compared to trial verdicts. The reason that this is a myth is because, again, it just depends. It depends on what trust you're talking about. It depends on the strength of evidence that you can provide. It depends on how many different trusts you're able to access. The bankruptcy trust system has been set up as a benefit to not only the companies who have declared bankruptcy, but also to the people who have gotten sick. And so we've been incredibly successful with cases that only seek compensation from bankruptcy trust claims. And so it just depends on the individual circumstances, and certainly can be much more than what you might think of as chump change and actually be worth your time pursuing. Finally, the final myth, taking a settlement means giving up. So I, as a lawyer, this one in particular, I have a lot of feelings about, let's say. So taking a settlement means giving up. Here is why I believe that that is absolutely a myth. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, litigating a case costs a lot of money, and there is a lot of risk involved, even in these cases that, again, I'm very biased. I think that there is a wealth of information that shows that companies knew what they were doing, and we have the documents to prove all of that. But regardless, anytime you bring a case before a jury, you're taking a very big risk. You are spending a lot of money. There is no way that you can predict what a jury is going to do with your case. And so I understand the sentiment that, well, if I take a settlement, that means I'm not being truthful, or I'm getting paid off, or, we're giving up. I understand that impulse, but the reality is that a lot of times settlements make a lot of sense for our clients. Not only does it eliminate that risk of going to trial and spending a lot of money and getting no money from a jury, and that is a very real possibility even in the best circumstances. A jury may come back and issue a $0 verdict, and then our clients go away with nothing, which is not what we want. So it provides certainty. It also provides very critical dollars for, again, our clientele who almost always either are very sick, or they're receiving chemotherapy, or they're getting radiation, and those medical bills aren't cheap. Or we are dealing with the family who is left to pick up the pieces after their loved one dies of a disease. And we're talking about elderly spouses who might depend on their deceased spouse's benefits, or maybe a spouse was still working when they got sick, and there's a homemaker, a spouse who has not worked in 30 years. Those people need funds to live and to be able to get the medical care that they need, and settlements can provide that in the way of money that supports their life as they're going through cancer diagnoses and medical treatment and all of the fallout that results from people getting diagnosed with a cancer. And so taking a settlement is not giving up. It is putting money into the pocket of people who deserve it, if you're asking me. That's it for today. I appreciate you listening. If you have any questions about what your case is worth, or you have more questions about any aspect of an asbestos-related injury, please reach out to an attorney. You're welcome to call our office. I'm going to put the information to contact us in the show notes. I appreciate your time. We do this because it matters. And at SWMW, we believe that people come first, people matter, and we know that the only way that companies are going to be held accountable is by willing to take the fight to them. I am Sophie Zavalia. Thank you for listening.